It would be a really big deal. The Supreme Court doesn't reverse major precedents like this very often. And it's really, I think, to my knowledge, never taken away what was recognized as a constitutional right for over half a century. The closest the court came once there was an idea that there was a right to work, but that right was primarily used to strike down laws that, like minimum wage laws, for example. It wasn't something that was usually used by the person asserting the right. And that's very different in this context. So it's unprecedented.
What do you make of the fact that this draft decision has leaked 1 or 2 months before the final judgment was due to be out?
Yeah, that's also really something I've never heard of before. I mean, when the news came of the leak, I didn't even know what to think. There's a kind of almost cottage industry in the United States of people trying to figure out who the leaker was and what their motives may have been. But the fact of the leak is part of, I think, a general kind of decline in the norms of the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court has long been a kind of uniquely collegial and not particularly partisan institution by the standards of U.S. politics. And both of those things seem to be changing. So the leak was extraordinary.
What are the implications of that, given that this does seem like a very partisan, very ideologically driven decision by a court that a lot of progressives will say was essentially stacked by a barely legitimate president in Donald Trump?
It's not going to be good for the court's legitimacy. We know that the court's public approval rating is the lowest it's been since anyone has measured that. It's at around 40%. Before the overruling of Roe, we would expect to see the court's approval go down likely even further, maybe into the 30 or 20% range. People's perception of the court tends to reflect whether they believe the court is above partisan politics or not. Of course, Donald Trump did the court no favors by claiming that it was his court, in his words. And the justices have been unusually aggressive in recent years in taking on a bunch of culture war issues and resolving them both in ways that are, I think, somewhat big, right? They're not trying to dodge the big questions and doing it in a kind of rapid fire succession. So the court is taking on one issue after another. Abortion is just the biggest one before the justices this term, but there are major decisions on guns, on clean air and water, on affirmative action, on voting rights, so on the rights of LGBTQ individuals. So this court is going to reinforce the idea that the court is partisan, and that's probably going to hurt it in the eyes of the American people.
Professor, explain to us what happens when Roe is formally overturned and how that will trigger a bunch of state laws that could see abortion restricted or effectively made illegal almost on day one.
Yeah, so abortion, it will likely be banned in about between 20 and 26 states, not long after Roe is overturned. This is as a result of what are called zombie laws and trigger laws. So trigger laws have some kind of trigger or provision that will automatically ban abortion if Roe is reversed. Zombie laws, by contrast, are just old anti-abortion laws that have been on the books since the 19th century, in many cases that were never repealed, that could spring back into effect when Roe is gone. And we think that taken together, roughly about half of the United States will be criminalizing functionally all abortions in a short order after Roe v. Wade is overturned.
For many decades, most people, including a number of Supreme Court justices who've now voted to overturn Roe, talked about Roe as being settled law, that it wasn't going to be revisited. Now that that has been thrown out the window, does this become the new settled law under this Dodd case, or could it be overturned again in a few years and everything changes up again?
It could be overturned again. I mean, the real obstacle is not the court's respect for settled law. It's primarily just the composition of the court. So there's now a 6-justice conservative supermajority. You would obviously need 2 people to retire or pass away and be replaced by a Democratic precedent to change that. But of course, from the standpoint of norms, if this Supreme Court is just going to overrule lots of stuff that's been around for decades without, pausing to take a breath, that's not going to set any kind of expectation that if the court's composition changes, it will respect this precedent. So there's a kind of unfortunate trickle down or cyclical effect. The more the court disregards precedent, the more future courts will feel they can do the same.
In the draft that was leaked, Justice Alito talks about how he views this as being limited to being about Roe, but others have said, well, I'm not so sure. If you can take away what was seen as a fundamental constitutional right when it comes to the right to choose to retain a pregnancy or not, you can also take away marriage equality. You can also take away a bunch of other things. Does this, in your mind, legally put other parent rights into question?
It easily could. I mean, the opinion's excuse or answer as to why it doesn't is essentially that abortion is different because abortion is the taking of a fetal life. But the court's methodology for explaining why there is no right to abortion would easily apply to marriage equality or a range of other rights. And the court's answer essentially is, well, at the time the relevant part of the U.S. Constitution was written, no one thought abortion was a constitutional right. And in fact, states were criminalizing abortion. And so that means that we look to the meaning that was attributed to the Constitution by the people who wrote it in the 19th century. Now, first of all, that may be a sort of strange conclusion to start out with, because we're talking about a court weighing in on women's rights by looking at what people believed at a time when people of color couldn't vote, and neither in many states, and women couldn't vote at all. So that, to begin with, is sort of strange. But if you take the court's premise, at the time the 14th Amendment, the relevant constitutional provision, was written, interracial marriage was illegal, same-sex marriage was certainly illegal, same-sex intimacy was illegal, birth control was illegal. That doesn't mean the Supreme Court has to reach all of those conclusions, obviously, but it does mean that if you take the court at its word that this is how we define constitutional rights, it wouldn't have to stop with abortion.
Finally, Professor, some court watchers have suggested that, well, this is a draft. Chief Justice Roberts could be a vote against, at least against full repeal. There's still a chance that he could convince one of the other justices that not to go all the way, if you will. Do you think that is still a possibility? And if so, how does this leak affect that possibility?
I mean, I think the leak makes it less possible because if someone changes their vote, they'll be perceived as caving to political pressure and will probably be derided by people on the American right as sort of someone who's more tuned in to politics than to principle. I think it's certainly, but you can never underestimate John Roberts, but I think it's pretty unlikely that he'll be able to pull this one off. So I would expect to see the court reverse Roe. Some commentators in the US have suggested that this has so damaged the court that the court would be better off dismissing this case as improvidently granted, essentially saying, oops, we shouldn't have even heard this, and then maybe asking for re-argument or taking another abortion case down the road. But I'd be surprised if that happens.